Amen. All right. So we're going to return to our study today of Israel and Palestine. We made it about halfway through last week, and we need to finish that history. Our aim here is to understand the nature of this ongoing conflict over the past 80 years and allow that to serve as a basis for our own reflection as we think about these things Christianly. So we're very appreciative that John's been willing to lead us in this. And so, John, if you'd come and take us the next step.
Just by way of a brief review, not long, we started way back in history to about 135, where Palestine was created. Up until then, it had been Judea, and it was the Emperor Hadrian who renamed it in order to wipe out the memory of the Jews. Some 500 years later, the Muslim conquest of what's called the Levant, that long eastern Mediterranean strip by the Arabs, led to the Muslim conquest and the Arabs move in. And so if you really want to talk about who has a long-term claim on the land, both of them. Because the Jews have been there for 2,000 years, then were evicted for 2,000 years, but the Muslims have been there for nearly 1,500. So, you know, after 1,500 years, you have some sort of claim on the land. But the partition we'll skip the pre-partition stuff. The partition in 1947 was not without a great deal of controversy. The UN voted overwhelmingly to do it. All of the Arab nations abstained. They refused to vote. They believed that it was a theft of Arab land. The founder, one of the founding fathers, one of the people who was instrumental in crafting the new government and in the Zionist movement, David Ben-Gurion, in his diary and letters to people, acknowledged we are stealing their land. He just came out and said it. And he said, of course they're going to be angry, and there's going to be what? Violence, conflict, civil war. Prior to the UN vote, Harry Truman is reported to have said to his advisors that he was not in favor of voting yes for the partition. And the reason was, he said, it will cause a permanent state of civil war. That was in 1947, and guess what? He was right. It's been a permanent state of civil war. And part of the reason is, if you look at them, if you have a map, I didn't reprint the maps, and you look at the partition, it was an impossible way to partition this land. It looks like a checkerboard. And part of the reason was they wanted to give people, if it's a majority Arab, they should stay. If it's majority Jew, they should stay. The problem is, Jews made up a small fraction of the people living in the area and got 60% of the land in the partition. War broke out immediately, on May the 14th, 1948, the day of Israel's creation. About 5 minutes after midnight, the war started, right? And it hasn't stopped. What they have had is ceasefires and cessations of conflict, but there's been no resolution to any of this. I won't go through all the attempts and stuff. It's on the timeline. But one of the most, I think, optimistic events was that in, let me look at it here, got to find my place, was the Oslo Accords. We're down to the Oslo Accords. And the Oslo Accords, let's see the exact date of that. I'm sorry, I got to find it. It's down the bottom here. Here's Accords. 93, right. It was right in front of me. Okay. One of the things that had happened at Madrid was that for the very first time, Israel agreed to talk directly to the Palestinians. Everything else had been brokered by other people. In 93, and so nothing happened out of Madrid other than they talked face to face, and they came to some agreements, none of which was implemented. The Oslo Accords were supposed to be the beginning of peace because what it was going to do was create an autonomous region in the West Bank and Gaza where the Palestinians could have self-rule. It established, based on the PLO, this Palestinian Authority. However, to be frank, the Israelis have never really allowed any autonomy in these regions. As long as they like what they do, it's fine. Otherwise, they find some way to put a stop to it. At the same time, the United Nations had voted that the Israeli settlements that were rapidly developing in the Gaza, not Gaza, but in the West Bank were illegal. And so Israel's response was to ignore that, and more settlements, more and more Jewish Israelis were moving in. Yeah.
Just to say a little bit more about these settlements. The settlements are, and John, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but the settlements, as I understand it, are typically populated by the more orthodox, more radical wing of Jewish religious society.
Absolutely.
They want to populate the territories that are recognized as Palestinian, and some Israeli governments have been more permissive than others in letting them do so, even though they're not internationally. It's recognized as not permitted, right. But Israel has not stopped these settlements, and that's caused a lot of tension between the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli government.
Right. And also there are religious elements. Once we get through the timeline, we're going to talk about 10 things that are really in the way of peace here. But the issue here for some of the Jews, the ultra-Orthodox, is to restore Israel to the boundaries at the time of Solomon, which means they've got to have the whole West Bank, Gaza, and part of the Sinai, and the Golan. Well, the Arabs don't want to give that up. Right. They don't want to give up any of it. And so from the beginning, the Oslo Accords were not going to work, and they haven't. And people on both sides will repeatedly refer back to the Oslo Accords as though they had standing in force. Now, they may have when you sign a treaty, but if nobody's paying attention to them, they don't have any standing in force. So, Israel was able to negotiate some peace treaties, and it looked as though things were moving forward until Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin in 1995, and he's the one that worked hard on these Oslo Accords, was assassinated. But he was assassinated. Does anybody know who assassinated him? His own people, an Orthodox Jew, an ultra-Orthodox Jew. He was not assassinated by Palestinians or anybody else, because they didn't want what? The peace process. At the same time, or just shortly before that, the Egyptian leader, Anwar Sadat, who had been instrumental in peace between Israel and Egypt, was what? Assassinated by, again, religious extremists. So this process starts to get derailed. The peace process collapses in 2000 with what's called the Second Intifada. Now, an intifada is an uprising. This was just all across Israel, an uprising. And Israel put it down hard. You can't not. When you have a large portion of your population rising up to shoot you in blow up buildings and so forth, and Palestinians came across this from the West Bank, and it was a mess. And so after the second, this is the second time, after the second intifada, Israel said no more. We're just not going to allow this to happen anymore, and cracked down. In 2004, Arafat died, Yasser Arafat, who was the mastermind of a lot of this. He was succeeded by Mahmoud Abbas. And the one thing that I believe, this is a personal observation, that characterizes Mahmoud Abbas is he's weak. Arafat had been a very strong leader of the Palestinians, had been able to orchestrate a lot of things, had been able to organize them, had been able to get people to follow him. Abbas is not. He's a politician. And that creates a real problem because in 2005, Israel, who had been in the Gaza Strip in force, had decided we're just not going to stay in Gaza forever here. You know, whatever happens to these people, they can govern themselves, right? And they pulled back out of Gaza.
Is that when they built the fence?
Yeah, part of that, yes, but there is no, that's really on the West Bank, what you're talking about. If you've ever seen that wall, okay, that's West Bank. Go ahead.
In response to the Intifada, the second Intifada, the Israeli government started building a wall that literally, like the Berlin Wall, separated the West Bank and the Palestinians from Israel completely. And it, you know, when you build a wall, it shuts down commerce, it shuts down employment, it shuts down all kinds of things. But the goal was to ensure that there couldn't be any movement between the two territories. And they were pretty successful. I mean, that was the point.
That is the point. That's a good point. Because I'm just going to have to mention the wall again, and that is because the wall, as Jeff said, cuts off movement between the West Bank, and it cuts off movement into Israel proper. Where do the Palestinians work? In Israel. That's where the good jobs are. So there were long lines of people trying to get through the few checkpoints back and forth every day to try and go back to work. So they began to feel like they were what? Prisoners. They've always wanted their land back, but now they really are contained. There's a critical election in 2006, and that is Hamas won the legislative elections. Now you got this new group, right? And the PLO is seen as weak and ineffective and often working with Israel. Because during this, although they have their, quote, own security forces, the Palestinian security forces are there to keep order in the West Bank, mostly. And so they often work with the Israelis to what? Arrest their own people suspected of plotting terrorist attacks. So the PLO loses the legislative election, and now we have Hamas. And the next year, after a great deal of violence between what's actually the governing wing of PLO is Fatah, violence between Fatah and Hamas seizes control of Gaza. So although Mahmoud Abbas claims to be the spokesman for and the head of the Palestinians, he's really the head of the Palestinians in the West Bank, and that's it. The 2.3 million or so Palestinians who live in the south in Gaza are under the control of Hamas. Now, it's very popular today for people to say, well, they don't like Hamas. they voted them in. And this was not, this was not a rigged election. They were sick of Fatah and hoped that, no, not necessarily. They regret it because they were being bombed, but they don't necessarily regret the fact they voted them in, because one of the things we're going to talk about is what are the barriers to peace and makes this so difficult. So from 2008, there have been violent confrontations between Israel and Palestinians, periodic Hamas rocket attacks, sometimes as many as 300 or 400 a weekend from Gaza, and an increase at the same time in what? Illegal settlements. Netanyahu has, and the Supreme Court has ruled that you can't do this. And occasionally they bulldoze one out, but otherwise they what? They kind of let them go. And so you've got an increasing incursion into particularly the West Bank by the Israelis, and increasing violence in Gaza that lead to several violent confrontations, shellings, rocket attacks by Palestinians, aerial attacks and bombings by the IDF. And that's going, of course, to today. From December 17th, 2010 to December 2020, the Arab Spring created what? Remember? Complete instability in the region. Stable governments like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and these countries that had been, yes, you could say they were dictatorships, but they were relatively stable, right? I mean, you could predict what they were going to do. The Arab Spring uprisings, which they were, led to the overthrow of some of these dictatorships. But what replaced them in many cases was a fundamentalist Muslim, in some cases, a jihadist state. Or if it didn't become that, at least it left behind it, through the Muslim Brotherhood and others, these elements. So now you had a relatively stable Egypt who is now at war with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, but also where? In the Sinai. Because it's where they went. You have the rise of Hamas and Islamic Jihad as now supported members of, or outgrowths of, the Muslim Brotherhood. And you have an Iranian government that is funding all of this. Because their vision, and the Houthis, for example, in Yemen. So their vision is a what? A fundamentalist Islamic caliphate with them in charge, Iran in charge. So we're going to talk about the geopolitics in this a minute, but let's get through the timeline. So this has been going on, and so the Arab summer is now referred to by a lot of historians as the Arab winter, right? It's September 15th, 2020, not that far ago, the Abraham Accords signed by Israel, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain to normalize relations between those three countries. That was an enormous achievement because they had refused to recognize Israel to have anything to do with them since 1948. And what did this allow? It allowed for the first time since 1948 for Arab tourists from those countries to fly to Israel to visit the holy sites. It was an enormous achievement. And we're just going to leave that there for a minute because that creates its own problems, okay? But in April 15th, 2022, Israeli police raided the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound that created outrage in the entire Muslim world. Jews were not allowed and are not allowed under Israeli law to worship on the Temple Mount. They can visit, but they can't go there and worship. That was, from the very beginning, that was the deal, because do you know who controls the Temple Mount? Who owns it? Jordan, the king of Jordan. Right. After all of 67, when they took Jerusalem, the Israelis said, okay, we're not about to touch these holy sites, if we think we had trouble before. So the king of Jordan, in whose land that was, retained custody, if you will, in Jerusalem of this compound, this mount. So Jews had been going in there to pray. Violation, right? More fundamentalist Muslims began gathering there to start throwing rocks and so forth. They intended, apparently, to start a confrontation. Well, they did. The Israeli police took the bait. They went in there and had a confrontation right in front of Al-Aqsa Mosque in the Dome of the Rock with these Arabs. They're armed with machine guns, and the Arabs are throwing rocks at them, and the whole Muslim world's looking. So, it's no surprise that on October 7th, this attack was called, I don't remember exactly, the Al-Aqsa Revenge or what. They've been furious about this and planning this ever since the Israelis went in. Now, does that blame the Israelis? No, because they've been planning a lot of stuff for decades, and that's what we're going to talk about now. But right now, Israel has launched the largest ground invasion since probably 1973. And there are, I don't know, so far 8,500 or so Palestinian civilian deaths. And there are going to be more, because Israel has said the only way that we can be safe is we have to completely dismantle Hamas and the Islamic Jihad. And they are in tunnels. And for example, maybe you heard about the Al-Silwa hospital, where all these people are. And why is Israel attacking this hospital? Because the main command and control structure and communication structure for Hamas activities is in the basement. So, what are the limits of warfare? Jeff's going to take that up. The ethical limits, but the practical limits are you got to get in there and destroy that. And so that's ugly. It's going to get uglier, and it's going to create more problems, because right now the Saudis have called a conference of 5 Arab nations to talk about what? This problem, what's going on in Gaza. They've already called for a worldwide embargo of arms against Israel. They did that, I think, on Friday. So this ain't going away anytime soon. But hopefully that's a timeline of how we got here. But that doesn't explain why, after all these years, we can't settle this. Well, I said we on purpose. Part of the problem is who tried to settle this? The United States. We tried to go in there and impose a settlement on people. We never went in there and said, let's get everybody together in one room and stay here till we fix it. We always went in with a plan, right? None of which were ever going to work. It's part of a global issue here, a geopolitical problem. And so I'm going to talk about 10 things. Russia did, yes, in the old Soviet Union, for the same reason. It had nothing to do with we care about the Palestinians. Let's be fair here. This was about global influence. But we should have learned a long time ago, you can't go into another region and try and impose a solution on them that they didn't come up with themselves. But why haven't they been able to? What would peace in the Middle East look like? if they actually achieved a peace, what would it look like? First of all, Israel would be absorbed into the life of the Middle East. There's no other way. In other words, a real peace would make Israel a partner in the region economically, politically, and what? Militarily. You can't have a peace if you're isolated the way they are now. You have to what? Participate in the part of the world you're in. Right? But what would that do? First of all, Israel would be the dominant member of any coalition militarily and economically. They have one of the best, strongest militaries in the world, certainly dominating everybody in the Middle East. They have the strongest economy in the Middle East. They're a high-tech superpower, and none of their neighbors are. So if you're part of an Arab coalition and you invite these people in, who do you invite in? Somebody who's going to essentially take over economically, et cetera, because you can't compete with them right now. You got all the oil in the world, but you don't have all the other products, technologies, et cetera, that Israel has to offer, and a global market. So, it would also mean the return of the Palestinians, open borders for tourism, trade, and employment. There's no other way to settle this. Even if you have a quote, two-state solution, there has to be, in the sense of, if they're going to have a real peace, right, an open border here, what are the Palestinians going to do? Go home. Right? Also, trade with the Arabs and large tourism, and there'll be huge tourism because people will want to come to Israel to see what? The Muslim site. So a language that must become part of this is going to be what? Arabic. Israel will fundamentally change. The Israel that they have formed, the Israel that they have wanted to build, the dream, will be what? Gone. They will be absorbed into a multicultural society. There's no other way this can happen if they open it up. They cannot be a lasting peace, an open peace, without opening those borders. That means change, right? The Middle East should not be called the Middle East. That's a map description or a globe. What it really is the Arab Muslim East. The one thing that identifies and unifies all of these people, from Turkey to Iran to Iraq, south to Pakistan, and across to the Atlantic and North Africa, is they're all what? Arab-speaking Muslims. Now, they speak Farsi in Iran, but it's a united Arab world. And I did work with the Washington Interfaith Council, and I worked actually mainly with Hindus. But we had sessions with, and I got to know an imam from a large masjid or mosque in Washington, and he said, we are different culturally in many ways. He said, our languages are different dialects. He said, some of us are Sunnis, some of us are Shias. He said, but there's one thing we all are, and he says, Muslim. And if you go anywhere in the world, Sharia is Sharia is Sharia. And right now, you've got this mass of Muslims surrounding the one, what? Non-Muslim, Western-style country in the whole region. If you let them in, you are no longer what? You're no longer a Muslim region. you know that you will become what? You're going to have to be open a bit. It will just happen, right? And even if it doesn't, you've got a, quote, non-Muslim member. And no, there was an Egyptian writer whose name I can't remember, wrote it at least 10 years ago. He said that no current Islamic regime is going to do that. It's going to let them in as a full partner. It's not going to happen. There have to be restrictions because they can't politically with their own people and religiously, and so it's an enormous barrier. And the son of the founder of Hamas, right, defected to Israel in the 1980s. He didn't physically go over there. He became what? A spy for the Israelis. And in the 90s, he fled into Israel. I think he currently lives in the United States. He was interviewed early this week, and he said the West is naive and making a mistake. He said, this is a religious war, and don't think it's not. He said, you in the West keep trying to be nice, but you can't deal with this until you recognize it's a religious war. Hamas is a religiously based organization, Islamic Jihad, et cetera, et cetera. Go ahead.
Just to support what John is suggesting, there are those who have imagined, and there are state actors who have adopted the hope that what John is describing is possible, at least for their nation state. So, for example, as terrible as the current leader of Saudi Arabia is, he's hopeful for normalization with Israel. Now, this may scuttle it.
Yeah.
But they're still saying things like, we don't want that to be scuttled. There's several countries who are willing to be involved in that conversation because the proposition is the more we can normalize relations with Israel, which have not been normal for a long time, if we can normalize them, then that lowers the prospect of war in the future and raises the prospect of economic prosperity for our country that could trade openly with Israel. Now, it's not an exact analogy. In fact, there are lots of ways it's not the same. But, you know, if you look at the conflict in Northern Ireland, you know, that conflict came to a violent head in the 60s and persisted for 30, 40 years of brutality. You know, the IRA would blow up a restaurant or blow up a bus or blow up, Mountbatten's boat, killing Mountbatten, and the British Army would respond and would respond brutally. And the conflict deepened and deepened and deepened. And it wasn't until they achieved what you might call a kind of political settlement where they could recognize Sinn Féin, the party that represented this faction of Northern Ireland. Did they find the prospect of achieving a kind of peace? And they did so, and it was going very well. Now, Britain's vote to leave Europe meant that now there's big questions about how are we going to deal with the borders again. And the fear of limiting those borders, exactly what John's talking about, limiting normal trade, normal interaction, political dialogue, all the things that would come with some kind of normalization of relationship. There's fear that that can undermine what has been now for over 20 years a kind of peace in Northern Ireland. Well, what we're talking about, they haven't even gotten there yet.
They haven't gotten there.
But if they could, with Saudi Arabia, and each state could find a way to normalize with Israel and Israel with them, there is some hope that, maybe it's not peace, but it's less chance of conflict. Now, what John's talking about is peace, and that would be a radical openness. But whether that's ever possible is another question.
My feeling is no, it's not in our lifetime. But what we're moving toward is called by some writers a cold peace, meaning like a Cold War. There's a cold peace where each nation nobody's interested in going to war, and there are relationships one-on-one, but a real regional stabilized peace is out of the reach of, at least currently, out of the reach. And go ahead.
I was just going to say that, let's say you're Israel, and they've worked very hard over the last few decades of becoming a very modern, technologically advanced military. The whole thing, whatever they call it, that keeps the
Iron
Dome. They built a super duper fence and wall and all that stuff better than maybe we can learn from them. So you say, okay, I've got all these great toys that I've come up with. Am I going to share that with the Arab world, not knowing that someday they just might flip because once an Arab, always an Arab, and they're going to use that against them, like Iran is trying to do?
That is exactly the way they feel.
So how do you trust somebody?
That is exactly the way they feel. And I'm suggesting that as long as you feel that way, you can't get to peace.
And they don't even have water in the Gaza
Well,
Strip. They don't have their own water supply. They don't have their own electrical supply. They don't
That's
have
a
any
problem
of
of
those
the
things.
whole region. As I mentioned last
don't
week, one of the
have it.
things that has created terrible difficulties is Israel dammed the Jordan River and diverted the flow from these people so that they could have good agriculture. That's been an issue for decades. So I'm trying to be even-handed here and say both sides are entrenched, and both sides have committed to policies that make moving forward nearly impossible in a larger area. Yeah.
I haven't been over there, but is this Temple Mount, is this the Temple Mount from the Bible?
Okay. When Herod, there was a little mountain. Solomon built it's actually a hill. Solomon built a temple on it. It's not Zion. Zion is where David's palace was. But this is Mount Moriah. It's just a hilltop. When it was rebuilt, it was quite small and actually nothing like the original one because they didn't have the money to put the gold and everything in. Herod the Great spent 70 years rebuilding the temple, what we now call the Second Temple. It's actually an enlarged Second Temple. In order to do so, he had to bring in tons and tons and tons of huge stones and boulders and dirt to make a big place where he could build a big temple. And so what's left is the mound that Herod built, and the Wailing Wall, the west wall, in order to keep all that dirt and stuff there. These stones, I think they weigh somewhere around 400 tons. It's actually a big wall to keep the dirt in place of the temple, what was the Temple Mount. And yes, the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock are built on that platform where the temple used to be.
Well, I can see why the Jews would be upset. I mean, if they're told they can't worship up there.
Well, you know, that's a good point. It really is. But once you can go back to the founders of Israel, because the founders of Israel did not want there to be a, quote, religious Israel. Their vision was what they called, David Ben-Gurion and Herzl and others, their vision was what they called a socialist Zionism. They were communists. They were followers of Lenin. And so they had no problem without having that hill. As a matter of fact, they were a little worried if they did, it would create the kind of religious fervor that we see now that they didn't want.
And,
The founders of Israel, Theodore Herzl, David Ben-Gurion, they were not religious Jews, they were communists. Yeah. Now, to be fair, Ben-Gurion did, at the end of his life, say that he had come to believe in God.
and it's also important to remember that the Jews had not had possession of that physical place since 132 AD. So we're talking about 1,900 years, almost 2,000 years they haven't been there. The Christians had it for the first, well, from, about 300 and something AD. They had it for several hundred years. The Christians had it. And then the Muslim Arabs had it. And the Ottoman Empire had it for all that, 1,500 years or 1,400 years. The Arabs have controlled that space. And so they built a mosque there because that's where,
That's where
that's the Dome of the Rock.
And that's where Muhammad ascended to heaven to speak directly with Allah. That's why it's so sacred. But the people the founders of Israel understood the danger. That's why David Ben-Gurion's reported when at the end of 1948 war they had taken half of Jerusalem. The generals told him, we can take the other half by tomorrow morning. He called them off and made them stop because he didn't want to deal with that issue. So just one more thing, two more things actually. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States became the dominant player in this region. The people who had been close to the Soviet Union now relied on the United States for weapons, assistance, etc. But those Cold War rivalries now are caught up in local ethnic issues. Multiple states are seeking hegemony in the region. That is Iran, Turkey, Egypt. All of them want to dominate this. They all are reasonable military powers. They all want to dominate this region. So there's this tension between these states about why would we come together and why would we do anything with regard to peace or globalization unless what? Unless we're in charge. And in order for that to happen, they're reaching out to other people who are more than happy to reach in. And so you have now something we had not seen since the Cold War, which is now there's a geopolitical Cold War there that involves the US, Russia, and China, all of whom are now trying to establish dominance in the region the way it was before the Berlin Wall fell. So what does that say about the United States? In my opinion, in my reading, the United States, who had the dominant position for the last 30, 40 years, right, we let that region go. And our our influence has been eroded to the point where we can no longer effectively intervene diplomatically in the region. We got to go in there and talk like we were just another outside party, except for Israel, only because we give them so much money and arms. Go ahead.
Just to echo John's comment, it's fascinating to me to see these regional powers, Egypt, Iran, maybe even Turkey to a degree. You know, these are the old powers. These are the same players that are in the Old Testament. You've got the Assyrians and the Hittites up here. You got the Persians over here. You got the Egyptians down here. And they're all, despite the fact that this is a religious conflict in some respects, don't ever forget that geopolitical powers don't like doing anything more than manipulating religious sentiment. And so the people who want power will do everything they can to manipulate the religious sentiment to gain approval and support in their region. And so you've got at least three regional powers who are playing this game. And they're playing the same game that ancient Israel played with those, what were then world powers. Those regional powers are playing that game with us. So Saudi Arabia, you know, they try to stay as close to us as they can, even though they want to do their own thing. They stay as close as they can. You've got others who are flirting with China. You've got others who are flirting with Russia. The whole purpose of which is to gain political or geopolitical influence in the region and make sure they have the resources to do so. And they're constantly manipulating or trying to manipulate the religious sentiments of their own citizens.
Absolutely. And one of the things that has created this power vacuum, I'm going to say, is the United States. We began to look elsewhere. We began to look at Afghanistan. We re-engaged with Russia, and we weren't paying attention to all of the building projects and influences that China and money coming in from China and Russia's attempts to regain its position with the powers of the North vis-a-vis Iran and Turkey. And we just let the ball drop, frankly. I think we did. Same is true in Africa. And so once you do that, you can't necessarily get it back. Now, the other thing is that it's getting back to Israel, as you're gaining power within your own country and with your neighbors for your abilities to interact with what goes on in the world, who's the common enemy that's actually conveniently there for you to point a finger at? It's Israel. But Israel's own refusal to consider a two-state solution for decades and decades and decades has created an environment where all sides now have hardened themselves, and there doesn't seem to be much of a way out of this. And nobody in that region, I believe, is going to allow the United Nations, the United States, or anybody else to come in and dictate what the solution has to be. We're long past that. And the last statement I want to make, and I would stand by it, is if you take a look at the wars that have gone on in the Arabic world, that there is, at least for 100 years or more, there has always been a religious component. And we cannot understand this conflict unless we're willing to understand the role that religion plays in motivating the people of the region. Yeah. Now, again, one last thing. If you look at the camps, refugee camps, resettlement camps, you have to ask yourself, why after 75 years are they still there? Because nobody wanted these people. Nobody wants them. And so Egypt doesn't want them, Saudi Arabia doesn't want them, Jordan doesn't want them, Lebanon doesn't want them, Syria doesn't want them. But as long as they're there, they're useful. And they can push for a solution where they all go home again and they don't have to deal with them. But in fact, they know that's not going to happen. And the one way in which they can keep the talk up is to say they're our Muslim brothers and sisters. So it sounds like I'm putting all the blame on the Arab world. I'm not. You know, Israel has far too long, I think, had a mentality, a siege mentality of fear, and has not been able to go beyond that, to reach out, sometimes even in small steps, until recently. And part of the problem that we're looking at today, because the point of this 2 weeks was to say, how did we get here, is that outreach to Jordan, to Egypt, to Saudi Arabia threatens the stability of what I've been talking about. And so groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, are trying to derail any further movement. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, God made the problem when he agreed to make a great power out of Islam from Ishmael. He made that promise that they would become a great,
And
so
that and it,
set up ever since.
and that problem is they would be a problem for Israel. Go ahead.
Can you define the West Bank for me?
Okay, there's a map here. I got a copy, and I'll give it to you because I didn't reprint that this week, and I don't need it. So when Israel, at the end of the 1948 war, Jordan controlled, here's one in color. Jordan controlled part of what is now Israel. At the ceasefire, now Jordan was, in several books I've read, Jordan has been criticized by attempting to grab land, but not helping Egypt and Syria and others when they needed it, because King Abdullah was more concerned with grabbing all the land he could before this was over with. But in the ceasefire in 1948, he retained, meaning Abdullah and Jordan, retained a large chunk of land, which is on this map, that included half of Jerusalem and goes down below Hebron to about halfway down the Dead Sea and goes almost up to Nazareth. It's a large segment. It's called the West Bank because it lies on the west side of the Jordan River. During the 1967 war, the Six-Day War, when this lightning victory by Israel, in 1967, they occupied the West Bank as well as Gaza. Right. They went in. That is when they took East Jerusalem, and they took the rest of the West Bank along the Jordan River. That was the area that had been designated as a refugee area for all the Palestinians. So up until then, they had not had to deal with the Palestinian refugee problem because they were Jordan's responsibility. But once they captured that area and didn't give it back, now you got 700 or 800